So for those of you who may not know Monica, she is assistant professor and chair of the Mythological Studies program at Pacifica Graduate Institute. Her areas of specialization include decolonial, indigenous, and women of color paradigms and epistemologies, Anzalduan frameworks, earth-sourced and feminist spirituality and ritual, poetry, divination, oracular speech, and arts-based research and non-dual embodiment, and conversation with ancestral lineages from South Asia. Her books, and I think you've seen and you've probably sold a few of them while you've been here, include Wild Finn, Bright Parallel, and Kalapani. She is been a recipient of the Cultural Integration Fellowship's Integral Scholarship, the Sparks Prize Fellowship, the Zora Neale Hurston Award, and a Toto Funds the Arts Award. She is also affiliated with the doctoral program in visionary practice and regenerative leadership at Southwestern College in Santa Fe. And we are thrilled and honored to have her here with us this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you everyone for being here. Last session of a really rich conference, and there have been so many incredible resonances throughout the different sessions, and I'm sure you'll hear the echoes of some of the things that we've already been talking about or touching upon in what I'm bringing here today. And yeah, it's hot here, so I've put my hair up, but I probably still look a little bit scattered. That's how it should be, right? Well, let's start by just naming some rivers we know. So I'd like you to turn to the person next to you and just name a river, or name 2 rivers or 3 rivers. And as you are invoking your rivers, so I'd like to greet this land and the waters here, right? And I'd like to greet the living matrix, the web that is holding us all here, the ancestors that are holding us all here. And, I think of research as a way of coming into relation with the web of animate forces within the world, as, we've been talking about, especially in the arts-based research session, but everyone else, right? And each configuration of research gives an opportunity for everyone involved in the relations of research to be renewed. So in early July, it was Narmada herself who showed up wanting to be here at this conference. And she showed up in her yogini form as an oracle card. And here you can see an image of the Narmada at the Chauset Yogini Temple, the 64 Yogini Temple at Hirapur in Orissa. And she is one of the 64 yoginis. And you can see that she's standing on an elephant. When suggestions like this come, whether they are about work, whether they are about life, I tend to pay attention. This keynote today is happening because I accepted leaning into that call and asked, what is the gift of remembering that is seeking to emerge? Rivers have a sacred significance in most ancient earth-based cultures. In India, in the Vedic tradition, water is the primal element from which all forms emerge and to which all forms return. Rivers are mentioned repeatedly and consistently in the Hindu sacred texts, and many of the rivers are venerated as goddesses. Even as some of the myths and stories were committed to writing in the Vedas, the Puranas, the epics, the scriptures, you'll still find, if you start paying attention, that there are many different versions of the myths that circulate. And this is partly because it's the oral tradition that led to the writing still remains fairly strong in South Asia. The myths in South Asia are dynamically alive, and the myths themselves are interconnected, like the communities that they arise out of, right? So you'll see the versions of myths interacting amongst Muslims, Jains, Buddhists, Hindus, and Adivasi indigenous communities who are living by the banks of the Narmada. All these communities have their stories about the Narmada. So, stories, I don't see them as stable artifacts. I see them as dynamic, evolving. And in fact, what is happening right now with the river, to the river, is very much informing the myths, which is what we're going to be exploring a little bit in this presentation. The problem in India, in fact, is the appropriation and the reduction of sacred stories by the proponents of nationalism and fundamentalism, because they seek to use the myths and the religious symbols to create separation and division. And those who are familiar with strategies of colonialism, of course, recognize this to be a colonial strategy, right? One that was introduced all over the world into folk and indigenous frameworks to create separation, to create alienation. So again, in India, the syncretic folk and indigenous cultures were broken apart and fragmented at the time of the European colonialism. And this is persisting in post-colonial South Asia as a manifestation of coloniality. So we cannot really engage with South Asian mythologies without being aware of how they are being co-opted by nationalist and fundamentalist political formations, and asking ourselves, how can we create a different footing on which to have a conversation with the sacred? So many cosmo-mythological complexes see place as enspirited, right? And stories, Sharon Blackie reminded us yesterday, transmit the cosmology. There is a whole array of myths about the Narmada, including myths about her origin. And these myths are often jostling against each other. And, one myth says something here, the other myth or story will say something completely different. So I'm speaking about some versions that drew me particularly, that spoke to me particularly. And in some versions, I noticed that the Narmada, the river, was spoken about as being born of heat, born of tapas. The story goes, or some of the stories go, that Shiva was in deep meditation, was in a sort of an ascetic trance. And in that ascetic trance, which could have been born out of a still form of meditation, but some stories talk about him dancing the tandav. So he was generating so much inner heat, tapas, during that time that beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. And Narmada was born out of that sweat, out of the drops of sweat. So I was thinking about Athena being the father's daughter, and Narmada, like Athena, is supposed to be a virgin, and she has a fierce form and she has a playful form, right? She has a form that this is a very long river. This is the largest east-west flowing river in India. And Shiva apparently gave her a boon of always remaining inexhaustible, which I feel very tender about right now, especially given the damming that has happened of the river. Okay, I was watching that slide, but I can do this. So there are stories that also speak about how she wills the direction of her flow. So she's supposed to be a willful river. She's supposed to be a river who determines her own fate. And this is a river that is considered so holy that even the Ganga is set to come to her to bathe as a black cow when she needs purification, when she needs cleansing, and she's older than the Ganga. So I have, on the slides, I have some examples of the ways in which her spiritual energy is spoken about in the scriptures, in the Mahabharata, in the folk songs. And she's also, and this I love, that she's supposed to be a sister of the Nagas, the snake clan, the serpent clan, which is why apparently invoking the Narmada can neutralize any snake poison. There's a very unique form of pilgrimage associated with the Narmada. It entails a parikrama of the river, a circumambulation. Pilgrims usually carry only the essentials with them. The ask is to have faith that the Narmada will provide food and other things that they need for sustenance. And the parikrama can take months and years because this is a long river, right? And people are traditionally walking, and even more traditionally walking barefoot. So it is in a way an opportunity for the pilgrims to generate their own inner heat, their own inner fire of purification. By the time that they come back to where they started, the expectation is that they are reborn. And this is true for a number of pilgrims, right? And they are coming with that spiritual intent, not from a desire to pursue an egoic thing, right? And the pilgrims come from all walks of life. They come from they belong to all ages. And I just want you to see on the maps. So it starts at the Amarkantak. That's what Narmada originates. And you can see the distance it traverses. So it's moving through multiple geographical regions. It's crossing 3 modern states. And you can see that it's nestled between mountain ranges. It's nestled between hills, right? And that the mountains are giving rise to a large number of rivers and rivulets that eventually join the Narmada. So it's an incredible geographical region, and a large number of indigenous tribes live there because it's been a fairly inaccessible topography, right? And so we have the tribes that live by the banks of the river, and there have been some settlements, and now, of course, we're talking about times before modernity, where the state now wants to build roadways so that people who want to do the parikrama or the circumambulation can just drive around the Narmada. We're talking about like an older time, right? So for the indigenous peoples, the Narmada is a mother. She is a giver. She's not just any goddess. They see her very much as a mother figure, right? For almost 50 years, the banks, jungles, and valleys of the Narmada were the site of people's movements resisting the damming of the river, ecological fragmentation, their own displacement, and the erasure of their sacred and cultural links to the land. And when I lived in Delhi in the early 2000s, I attended a number of these protests, and there were hunger strikes, and the movements really stayed strong. People were really committed, and despite all of that, the dams did get built. And it wasn't a small number of dams that got built. You can just see the numbers right there on the slide. It was, that desire to harness the resource, that extractivism, right, was in full display. So I want to bring here the words of an indigenous activist, the late Pairvi Bai, who was deeply involved in the anti-dam struggle. And this is from an interview on oralhistorynarmada.in. I was really moved by these words. She says, how many things were in her belly and what all died. Now the river is dead, and along with it, we are also dying. And she goes on to speak about the dam as the death noose that choked the river to death and turned her into a bloated carcass. Some of you might already know that dams generate tremendous harm, ecological harm, human harm, submergence of land, forests, wildlife, homes, waterlogging, salinization, destruction of fish. And throughout the anti-dam protests, these dangers were being pointed out again and again and again, and they were set aside. They were ignored, right? So these harms are coming to pass. The dams are not just on the river, on the water. They are on our thought, and they are on our imagination. Robert Macfarlane tells us that the very meaning of river is impounded by dam walls, so that the river assumes for us the identity of our service provider. And this is why the people's songs that remember the joyful flow of the rivers, such as the Narmada, and praise the sweet sounds she makes, kal, 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 kal. This is why they're so important, because they connect us to the knowledge of her freedom and our freedom. And if we have time later, maybe we can, play a little bit of the song later on. Meanwhile, even though the dam has destroyed many of the temples and the shrines along the banks of the Narmada Parikrama, interestingly enough, is still happening. Although pilgrims are now circumambulating a series of artificial lakes with stretches of the original river in between. Of course, the original river is now heavily regulated by the dams themselves. So this makes me wonder what happens to the spiritual identity of the goddess and the ways in which she signifies purity and holiness and freedom. How will she survive? Meanwhile, the state can continue to oppress the human and the more than human worlds because the mythological complex has been detached from place, from the real, from nature. The river and her people have become second-class citizens in the state imaginary. The authoritarian state, the carceral state is continually drawing lines. I had to interact with the river outside these lines as an animistically alive presence, as a co-evolutionary force within an open system. We were also talking about complexity science, I think, in one of the previous sessions. And I had to do that to learn about what the indigenous people call the instructions. I have a quote here from Anishinaabe scholar Leanne Simpson. Even in her damned state, the Narmada knows something about keeping the network balanced, functioning, and bringing forth more life. So Leanne Simpson says the network is the map. It is the instructions. And humans have a very incomplete, impoverished understanding of how we fit into this network and how the network works. We need to commune to understand the instructions and to keep the network balanced, functioning, and bringing forth new life. So we were also talking about making earlier. I don't know if Elizabeth is here, but, I had to make, or at least attempt to make, a liberation sutra, right? So the proviso is that this is emergent, this is provisional. So I'm not going to fix it into something that's permanent and unchanging. And I'm going to invite you also not to stabilize it in that way, right? And before I could go there, because of course, the creation happens at all levels of being, out of the depths of a being, right? So I had to make peace with the sense of fear, tremendous fear, and a sense of failing and feeling disempowered that I was sitting with, both in terms of, the collective processes that we are moving through right now as a society, right? And as a global society, as a transnational society, and also within my life, right? Like I had to sit with that. And I had to really wrestle with the fact that autocrats everywhere are wresting away so much life. So we're in the long haul. This is a long haul, right? Like we have to be here. And resistance means being open to being afraid, being open to being stuck when we lose what is precious to us. Because it is likely that it's going to happen again, right? And perhaps a liberatory path will have us tuck these questions into our back pockets as allies, as needed as what spurs us into action. And I also found myself asking these questions. Can we undam our psyches without undamming our rivers? Can we contend with the ways in which we are domesticating ourselves, right? And in the ways in which we are domesticating our others, our kin, right? And this desire that we have to own, to control, to bring others into fixities, into servitude, right? And just, if we're not able to contend with that, can our freedom stand up to the autocrats? So some of you might know that there was recently a dam removed on the Klamath River in Northern California, right? And so river restoration is a process, but what we are learning is that rivers respond very quickly to attempts to heal, right? Like as soon as the dams are removed, life comes back. And a lot of these movements, dam removal movements around the world, are being led by indigenous movements, indigenous peoples, right? So here are some meditations in the vein of a liberation sutra that I'm just going to read through, and you can experience them as poetry. You can experience them as meditations, as provisional meditations, and you can experience them as a path of seeking. If they don't resonate, you can set them aside. They're addressed to the Narmada. You who are impetuous and fierce, plunged down chasms once, rushed over rocks once. Tell us, will the sacred survive its dissociation from nature? Will we survive being walled off from our own nature? if life is the opposite of death, you're indeed dead. Do you have life in you enough still to fight? Do you have life in you enough to know life? What if really you're asking us to find a way forward, a mode of movement that returns us to freedom when colonial apparatus crushes, obscures it? Our inner, outer transformations caught in man-made greed and calculations that see you only in terms of profit, measurables. How may we drink out of the green waters again? Restore you to relationship, ourselves to dignity. How can we find the flow underneath the fragmentation? In your belly, you carry Shiv himself, his stones, now crushed to make concrete for the dam walls. And carcasses and swollen, broken promises. And still, you persist. The dam swallows houses, all things growing, forms of life, traps buffaloes in silt. And still, you persist. All the dead are still heavy in your belly. The dead too have their patterns. The dead will have their redress. Everything changes. The desire to be alive fills all life. Death returns as itself or remakes itself into life. Even walls are leaking life. Let me make a practice of observing what is alive. Let me make a practice of flooding what I see with life. What I make a practice of will become river. Confounding duality, imprinted still with the ancient architecture of care, water teaches all to love. The carceral dams, too, cannot stop water from connecting, flowing, taking us home. You will spill as rain into dreams, an undammed future, becoming river, recreating into turbulence, liquidity, confounding of all borders. Thank you, everyone.